Just a quick question. So in your presentation, you talked about how this apocalypticalism it kind of crosses a number of sort of not just religious but also sort of some secular belief systems, maybe.
Yeah.
And then JM, you just ended talking about sort of Jade Helm and how social media can sort of amplify these messages like it hasn't been possible in the past. Do you get any sense of whether this is a truly different time we're in now in terms of these messages, either the breadth of these messages? I know, tough question. The breadth of these messages, or the scope of them, or is this just sort of another phase of sort of the apocalyptic sense that you have at any time in history?
So, in probably 2005 or 2006, when I wrote about how terrorists use the internet, I often sort of compared, and everybody was like, first time out of several times, everybody gets really hot about, how come these guys can use the internet? We need new laws and this and that. I wrote that, nobody was talking about banning paper in 1950 or VHS in 1980. I think there's quantitative difference now. I think there is, I've been very resistant to the, social media is changing everything kind of hype that has been around for some years now, but I think it's starting to become true. And I think that you can get, especially in terms of virality of ideas, you can really see an increased amount of virality. And most of this is harmless. Most of this is like, hey, is this a blue dress? And that's going to disappear in a day. That will outperform ISIS by 1,000,000 times, but then it's gone the next day. Whereas ISIS is still there doing the job every day. So I think there's a lot of patterns that we're going to have to learn to understand and processes that are much more complex than what was possible before.
I think that apocalypticism is kind of a natural human tendency. At least I tell myself that late at night when I find myself sweating thinking about global warming and the 2 degrees and all of this stuff. The way I kind of explain this to students is that on the one hand, there have been many times in human history when people thought the world was going to end in some way or another. I grew up a child of the 70s. My parents had a well-worn copy of the late great Planet Earth, Y2K, peak oil. I mean, in our times, and because everything's accelerated, right, we've seen these things happen again, these kind of apocalyptic scares. But something I always mention to my students is that from the perspective of non-human persons living on Earth, the apocalypse has already happened, right? We are in the midst of the 6th extinction, which is getting a lot of traction now. The number of animals that have been incorporated into human industry now basically exceeds the number of animals in the wild, right? Like the death of nature has basically already happened. From an external human perspective, yeah, there has been this kind of cataclysmic end. Sometimes things do end, right? The world could very well end, right? And I worry about these things, my hands shake, right? But from a sociological perspective, I think what the point I was trying to get at is just that apocalyptic is an interesting tool, right? It fits in with these other things, right? Like I said, like the use of sort of scriptural code words or themes, symbols, techniques of othering, right? Apocalyptic urgency has this power, right, of pushing projects forward. The shock doctrine. Right, Naomi Klein, right? There's kind of an argument to be made that, there's a secular form of apocalypticism which has infected American politics for the last 20 years, right? I don't know. I mean, if I was a sociologist, which I'm not, I'm a textual scholar, but if I was a sociologist, I could probably break this down in a more interesting and systematic way. What was your question? Was it that, is the apocalypse real? Is that the question?
No. If you're getting a sense that
is there something distinctive that's going on right now?
Is there something in terms of how that the message of the apocalypse is resonating different than we've seen in the past, or is it essentially the same thing? Is it just sort of resonating with humankind like it has for thousands of years?
I feel like there's a kind of a contagious power, right? And something that I always think about is that the way that, we meaning the American collective consciousness, right? We have defined ourselves over and against this boogeyman or actual monster and kind of a bit of both of radical Islam, and yet sort of moves that we make in our own society mirror those that we see radical Islamists making, right? I think it's a natural tendency of like ideas becoming current. You see people making the same sorts of interpretive, ideological moves, something like that. It's widespread because communication is so much faster now, right? Window on the world.
I would add to that there's a direct correlation between communications revolutions and apocalyptic expectations. And you can see it in the printing press, which was slower in its impact than the internet, but the early 16th century saw the outbreak of a wide variety of apocalyptically inspired new religious movements, known retrospectively as the Protestant Reformation, but from Luther on. And the use of printing to spread the word was, by their standards, viral. So I would say that the internet, this is one of the things that Brenda Brescia was the first to point out, is that the first people onto the internet in the 1990s, first religious groups, were the apocalyptic brands. So for instance, Lubavitch was the first Jewish movement to have a presence on the internet, and so on. So yeah.
I think that's a great point. I would just also say that Twitter in particular, I think, is to use the terminology from your book, is this rooster's medium. It's
yes.
Short.
Well, I like Alpha Predator too. That's a great.
That was good. I thought that up on the spot. Actually. I didn't have that prepared.
Raptors.
It's for roosters. It's for short messages.
Yeah.
People get worked up in a hurry, and there's no room to really have a thoughtful pushback. So,
Charles.
You raised this question of a discontinuity, sort of qualitative change in social media that it's introducing, and obviously it goes way back to printing. But whether social media introduces something in the way of repetition, so that I love your image of sitting there on your big screen and watching all the thousands of Twitters going across the screen. But my impression is that there's enormous repetition in what's being said. And the psychological principle is repetition intensifies experience. So, and the more repetition, the more intensification, and that may be at the heart of what qualitatively changes when you introduce Twitter at that level of repetition. People sitting around writing thousands a day. It's an incredible. And it seems, from what you're reporting, it seems as though they intuitively understand that it's going to have that much greater an impact if it's done by the thousands, not by the hundreds.
yeah, it may be more than intuitive too. This is a pretty organized, sophisticated program, and repetition is a big part of it, and that's a really great point. ISIS, unlike Al-Qaeda, ISIS continually redistributes its old material. So they're constantly re-uploading old videos, they're constantly reposting them. If there's not something new, then you're getting a host of reruns. And, Al-Qaeda's not doing that.
The
And that's
cable
one reason
TV
they're
of,
drifting. Yeah.
although one of the things that I'd say is that, it's characteristic of apocalyptic expectations that the more intense they are, the more short-lived they are. And that although the repetition and the intensity can work in the short run, in the long run, it begins to wear. So that, I think it's almost it's almost a predictable element of apocalyptic expectation that the more intense it is, the shorter it survives.
And therefore, it may burn itself out.
Right.
Yeah, ISIS...
But in the medium of the Twitter, as you're arguing, that may be what really is qualitatively distinguishing this current phenomenon of
And then we may end up seeing channel surfers who move from ISIS to the next interesting compulsive repetition.
And there's two things ISIS does to offset that fading. One is that they have these professional tweeters who just are on there every day putting this stuff out. So they're not people who are just enthusiastic. It's their job to appear enthusiastic. So they have that going for them, and they have something else that has now slipped out of my mind while I was saying the other thing. So I'll let it go.
Cool.
Real quickly, I know it's late. This is mostly for David. I was wondering, since in light of this conversation about social media, if you could tell us something about the way that Boko Haram uses social media, if it uses social media? Are there Twitter accounts with Don Fodio on them? I never.
Yeah, very minimal, very minimal. Actually, I think that Boko Haram is an example so far of a low technology Salafi jihadi movement. The quality of the videos that you have is fairly minimal. It's very heavily focused upon the personality cult of Shekau. Now, what you see is that since the amalgamation with ISIS at the beginning of this year, definitely their quality has gone up. But because of the offensive on the part of the Nigerians and others, there hasn't really been that much material that's been put out, and there's definitely no real good track record of like Twitter or any other things that are associated with something like ISIS.
Yeah, there's a few relatively recent additions. So there were sort of scattered people on Twitter from time to time, but nothing really kind of organized. And so now there is, under the auspices of ISIS, they are building that out, but it's still in
Are
development.
there limitations of language and literacy? Is the language that they use just not on Twitter? Or?
Yeah, I would say that northeastern Nigeria is basically an area that's pretty much cut off from a lot of internet connection. I mean, when I traveled through there in 2009, it was extremely difficult to find any internet connections. And as usual in West Africa, what you find is there's actually a religious divide at that particular point. That almost all things that are connected with technology are actually in the hands of Christians. And so when you go to like Kano or other different places, even though they're Muslim majority, almost always like an internet cafe or area is going to be dominated by Christians. And so I think that up until the very recent past and the association with ISIS, I think that there was kind of a move away from that material. It's sort of foreign, it's out of our control, and that will probably change as ISIS does start to influence. But I think that that's hitherto been the paradigm.
Yeah, and I would say the stuff I've seen isn't really organic to Nigeria. It's more ISIS deploying its machine on behalf of Boko Haram rather than or big organic. Also, I think in the work that I've done on this, which is not super extensive, but I've seen more Facebook usage in Nigeria, which is harder to track for various reasons in a big data kind of way. So.
All right, so thank you very much. We'll begin again tomorrow at 10.